Hi, okay, so this is a response video to discussion number 6, and because you guys just finished this, I'm sorry my voice is a little hoarse. I have a bit of a cold or something going on, I'm not quite sure. So I think overall, most of you thought that the personal and psychological were I guess the category that was the most influential on Mary Shelley's writing of Frankenstein. I'm not surprised. That's pretty typical. Most people tend to have that. What I really wanted to talk about, hold on. Don't want it to update anything. Don't change anything. What I really wanted to talk about was number 2. And so, and I know the way that I've worded the question, because I'm actually saying that they're more different than alike. Why did Mary Shelley title her novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus? And some of you really focused on, so then, because I'm saying they're more different than alike, why would she do this? So a lot of you focused on what was similar between them then, which is, I know, because the way the question's worded makes sense. And so, a lot of you talked about, obviously, defying the gods and sort of cheating. He sort of cheats death, and Prometheus cheats Zeus, and creating life, and then also, being punished. That was the big thing that a lot of you talked about, was the fact that both Victor and Prometheus were being punished. Some of you did touch on the fact, on some of their differences as well, which, I'm glad that, some people have both of those in there. What's interesting, though, is, I guess, why is Victor being punished versus why is Prometheus being punished? What I find really fascinating about Mary Shelley titling her novel, like the second half of the title is, or the Modern Prometheus, is that, to me, Prometheus and Victor are so incredibly different. Because Prometheus cares about his creations. He cares so much, he was willing to risk the wrath of Zeus. He ends up getting, tied up and having his liver pecked out every day. And I mean, it's a great story, right? But he's willing to take a lot of risks to take care of his creations, because since Epimetheus wasn't thinking very much and he just took everything and made stuff, Prometheus taking his time, he ended up without, right? He said he didn't have some of the best materials. He didn't have fur, and he didn't have claws, and he didn't have all of these things that would help protect his creations. So he felt as if, since his creations were vulnerable, that he had to take care of them. We see none of this in Victor, which is why I remember thinking, yeah, they both create life, they both get punished. But other than that, why is she titling it the Modern Prometheus? And part of it is also, Percy Shelley wrote Prometheus Bound. Yeah. And I'm sort of sure that there's probably some things going on there. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about is not just the fact that he's like Prometheus, but it says the Modern Prometheus. So we have a couple of things, like that word modern in there, sort of referring to, I think, the use of science instead of, godly magic, right? You have science that's being used to have this creation. And another thing, at least as I see it, and again, this is just my interpretation from what I know of her biography and what was, happening at the time, was that it could also be a bit of a condemnation of this modern Prometheus, right? That this modern Prometheus doesn't take care of his creations, whereas the original Prometheus did. And it could also be, and I know I've spoken about this before, I know some people have actually written about this too, the idea of, like, Percy not taking care of his kids, like his first 2 kids, leaving his wife. And even though I'm sure Mary was glad that Percy left his wife because she wants to be with Percy, it's not just Percy, but then, the man who was first married to, that wasn't married, but the man who was with her mother, who was the father of her half sister, right? And then left Mary Wollstonecraft when she was pregnant to raise her daughter by herself, etc. William Godwin steps in, right? And so there's, Byron's not that great of a dad either. When he does finally get her sister's daughter, now this is later, but still, this is sort of a trend of what was happening. He just puts the child into a convent, a nunnery, to be raised there. And so there's just a lot of irresponsibility when it comes to men fathering children, especially in her life, at least. She's seeing a lot of this, that they either don't marry the woman and leave, it's all the woman's burden, or they have a child and they don't spend any time with it. And I'm sure she kind of felt that way at times with her own father. You can see there are hints of that. There's some talk of that in her biography and the information, and not only in the book, the additional materials in our main text, but also in the Hitchcock book. So, she has a lot of men in her life, or that have been connected to her life, who have not taken care of their children. And so this could also be, I'm not saying it is, because if Mary Shelley's not alive for me to ask her, but it could also be Mary Shelley's condemnation of the irresponsibility of fathers in her society, in her culture, in her time. And so that could also be another reason for that, the modern Prometheus, right? He's not a Prometheus or a new Prometheus, but the modern Prometheus, which means like really of this time. And so, I know, that's kind of my thought on that. I would have to agree with you on the first one, that probably her, at least as it seems right now, that her personal and psychological influences were probably the greatest. Though I would say that there are also a lot of artistic and literary influences going on with the Romantics. Her husband is a Romantic poet. She's a Romantic writer. And so the Romantic literary movement that was going on has a lot to do with all the nature in it, and a lot of the struggles that the creature goes through. So there's a lot, and there's things from Coleridge and Milton, even though Milton's not a Romantic, but still that's it's still a literary influence. So there's a lot of, I think, literary influence, which would make sense since she's a writer, and she really kind of grew up in that. As far as the scientific and industrial, the industrial, I would say, is really the Industrial Revolution is a really big influence, because it has to do with the working classes. And so now all of a sudden this peasant class becomes a working class, which has money, not a lot of money, but some money. And so you start seeing a rise of what is considered like the middle class, and that starts to cause a lot of problems for people in power. And people tend to look down on these lower classes, don't think they should be educated, but we're starting to see that some of these people, because they're working, because they're having more, financial freedom and prominence, that they are becoming educated, and they are just as smart as everyone else. So we can kind of see the creature as being part of this lower class, working class that's trying to work his way up through education, etc. So that's a really there's a lot of interesting commentary that's going on there through the creature. And that's also political. So that industrial is also a very political commentary, as well as looking at the political cultural of how women were treated. And you're going to see that you see it with Elizabeth, you see it with Justine, that they wouldn't listen to her. They wouldn't listen to Elizabeth. They probably would have listened to Victor, unless he thought people would think he was crazy, but still, when a man spoke, they took that into consideration. They still thought that women were all emotions and no logic, and so you know, they had no power, and that's a big issue in this in the novel itself, is the idea that women had no power. I've had some students before say that they think they're like, how can Frankenstein be a feminist writing, be like pro female, and because, you know, all the women, like none of the women, like the story's not through any of the women's eyes, like the women don't narrate any of it, and they all have these horrible lives, and like they really don't get a voice, right? The women don't get much of a voice at all, and but that's precisely it. If you wanted to look at it in sort of a feminist way, it's the fact that they have no power. They don't really have a voice, because it's Robert Walton writing the letters, and it's Victor recounting the story to Robert Walton. And so this is Victor's account of what Justine said and what Elizabeth said. It's even Victor's account of what the creature said until the end, when the creature shows up and we have his own voice. But you really don't get a lot from either of their perspectives, and they end up having no power, right? So, and because they have no power, look what happens to them in the end. So Justine ends up unwarrantedly, right? I mean, she's convicted of a crime she didn't commit, and she's hanged for it. And then Elizabeth ends up being killed because Victor refuses to tell her what's going on until after they're married. And I mean, personally, if some guy had a major secret and I was getting ready to marry him, I don't know if I'd marry him until I found out the truth. But she really didn't have a whole lot of a choice. She didn't have money. It was Victor's family who had money. And, you know, this was basically the marriage that that was kind of sort of arranged since the beginning. I mean, that's kind of what they wanted. Though it's not set up as, yes, this was an arranged marriage, but this was the family's wishes, and she didn't have any power of her own because she didn't have any money of her own. So she really was at the mercy of his family. I mean, they were kind to her. It's not like she was, like, they treated her horribly, but I mean, she really didn't have any power on her own. And there was really nothing she could do other than take care of everybody and hope it worked out for the best, and it didn't. And so that's what we see, is we see, you know, the two women. Well, you've got Victor's mother, who dies in the beginning, right? Victor's mother, who's super kind and takes care of everybody else, and then ends up dying. And so you have this woman who is a great mother but dies early, you know, when Victor's young. And then we have Justine, who is also caring. I mean, she loves William, takes care of William, and she ends up dying because she's hanged for a murder she didn't commit. And then we have Elizabeth, who is steadfast with Victor despite him trying to push her away, despite everything else. She stays with him, she takes care of him, she does all the things that a woman should do according to, right, their time period, and she still ends up dead. So I mean, yeah, granted, Clairville ends up dead and Victor ends up dead, but they have a little more of a voice. Victor has a huge voice, right? And he doesn't die until the very, very end. So that's how I think you can really look at it as a feminist text, in the sense of showing how these women came to no good end, right? They had these miserable ends to their lives, simply because they were doing the right thing, simply because they had no power, they had no voice, and even when they tried to stick up for each other, it didn't work out. So, okay, that was sort of the response I wanted to give you for this particular one. I know you guys are still, I've gotten some questions about the Ancestor Project. If you have questions, make sure you get a hold of me, and I look forward to taking a look at your next discussion.